So tell me about the fish stocks in the UK as we see them now compared to pre-industrial levels.
Well, today fishermen are beginning to see a better life for themselves than they were 5 or 10 years ago.
Right.
There's an improvement in management for some stocks in places like the North Sea. Some other places like the Irish Sea, though, are incredibly overfished and are yielding now only a handful of species like scallops and prawns. But if you look at the stocks that are supposedly on the rebound, things like cod in the North Sea, and go back in time, the picture today looks rather bleak compared to what people are beginning to feel about the industry. And looking back, there were far, far more big fish around the UK than there are today. In the early 19th century, we caught them close to the shore, literally within a short period of rowing offshore, a couple of miles offshore. Huge fish were there for the taking.
Yeah, I also remember you in your book talking about them just sort of, there was just such an abundance of fish they didn't really know what to do with them, so they were throwing them onto the fields as fertiliser.
Well, that was particularly the case for things like pilchards and herring, because they were caught in huge quantities and they simply couldn't be sold before they spoiled. So they used them for the next best thing.
And there was no need for trawling anyway, because there wasn't the market and there was just so much fish out there.
That's right. And so trawling, which is the dragging of nets across the seabed, that didn't really take off until the railway spread inland. And it opened up new markets for fresh fish. So when you could get the fish from the coast to somewhere like Leeds or Manchester or Birmingham, and they would be there in a fresh state, then people felt it was worth investing in methods of catching fish that would yield much bigger catches than the hook and line and the nets which have been used before that time.
But trawling's been going on since the Middle Ages, isn't it?
It has, but it was very much a minor activity. So the first mention of trawling that we know of goes back to the 14th century. Incidentally, it was a complaint about the destructive nature of trawling, and it's a wonderfully eloquent complaint at that. It starts that the commons petitioned the king that where in creeks and havens of the sea there used to be plenteous fishing to the benefit of the kingdom, certain fishermen have subtly contrived an instrument made in the manner of an oyster dredge, but be it longer and larger and heavier, and they go on to say how it's destroying the flowers of the land below water, and it is destroying the small fish upon which the great fish are accustomed to feed. So here were people who were confronted with a fishing method which they saw to be destructive of the resources that sustain them.
No, absolutely. And one of the problems is that all this destruction that is happening and has happened is all underneath the surface of the sea, so we can't sort of notice it's there. You talk about, you make a nice reference or comparison to the Serengeti and having all the large mammals stripped out of it.
You can see that. You can see it very directly. And one of the reasons I think that the commoners made their complaint to the king in the 14th century is because at that time the estuaries in which they were fishing were much clearer water than they are now, and they could look over the side of their boat and they could see the seabed in great detail. And the reason they were clearer was because the bottom was carpeted in filter feeding invertebrates like oysters and sponges, and that meant that the water was constantly being purified. And so here they were looking at this ecosystem, and then somebody drags a net through it and rips a swathe through that beautiful underwater environment, and they could see immediately that this was wrong. This was not a good way to go about getting fish.
When we go to the coast and look down, and we don't really see much, what we're looking at is a kind of ghost habitat, but we've become used to it, haven't we? This sort of sense of, oh, this is kind of normal. This is what the sea's supposed to look like.
That's right, and what is normal? Well, for most of us, it's a deeply impoverished sea compared to the one that would have been familiar to people in the early 19th century. There isn't what used to exist on the seabed. The seabed is pretty much mobile sands and muds and gravels today, whereas then it was this forest of invertebrates, and they were all busy filtering the water and keeping it clear and beautiful, so that it would be possible to connect with what was below water then much better than we can do now in the muddy estuaries and the kind of murky green waters of the shallow coast.
So it's the trawling and the dredging that's just sort of knackered the seabed, and then all the main fish have been sort of stripped out of it over several decades, really.
Well, that's certainly true, and in some places it's gone further than in others, and so I say the North Sea is in improving condition in terms of the fish landings, because the European Union's management of that fishery is getting better.
Is it?
But on the west coast,
it's nice to have some good news.
Yeah,
Really?
it is nice to have good news, and I've been saying this for a few years now, because there are some positive developments there. But on the west coast, things are really dire. And if you go to the Irish Sea, you can see an ecosystem on its last gasp. This is a place which in the 19th century was full of all sorts of big life. There were common skates, there were flapper skates, meters across,
Wow.
the size of rugs, working their way across the seabed. There were angel sharks, there were ling, there were hake, there were huge cod in there.
Yeah.
And all of that has gone. Now what we see is the dregs in the ecosystem. We've got scallops and prawns, and you could call them the mice and cockroaches of the sea.
Yeah.
They're the things that survive when all the rest has gone.
So if for many stocks we've depleted them down to, I don't know, 5% or 2% of their original sort of natural levels, you would think that actually it would be of great advantage to fishermen to actually allow those fish stocks to recover, because they'll be able to fish and catch many more fish much easier, presumably, with a smaller boat. If they just allowed those fish stocks to recover from, I don't know, 3% of where they are now up to 10 or 15%, then you would think it would be in their advantage.
Well, it would be.
To do that.
It would be. In fact, higher percentages really, 30, 40, 50% really of those historical population sizes will yield the biggest gains for them over the long term.
Yeah.
You can think about it very easily as akin to money in a bank account, and that money yields a certain amount of interest each year.
Oh, that's good.
And if you think of the fish in the sea as the money in your bank account, the interest is the amount that you can take that is sustainable over the long term. Now, if you've got a tiny amount of fish in the bank account, a tiny amount of money, it's going to produce a tiny amount of interest.
Yeah, at the moment, out of £1, we've got about 2p in the bank.
That's right.
And then we'll be lucky to allow that 2p to grow into 3p. Whereas if we had 60p in there, then every year we're going to get a 6p profit, 6p interest.
Well, the interest rate stays the same.
No brainer.
Yeah. If you have a lot of money, you get a lot more that you can take out.
What's the problem though? Because I can I've read your books, and it just seems it's a complete no brainer, and everyone would be a winner if we just allowed the set up some marine protected areas. Maybe 20 or 30% of the ocean would be in marine protected areas, and that it would there'd be an abundance of fish again, wouldn't there? And it would be great for everybody.
Well, that's part of it. Marine protected areas are an essential foundation for ocean recovery, and if you were to establish 30% of the sea as off limits to fishing, then the fish inside those places would live longer, grow larger, become more numerous, and because the big fish are the engines of reproduction in a population, then there would be many times more eggs being produced. Those drift into the surrounding fishing grounds, they boost populations there. So the marine reserves are an important part, but it's no use hammering the rest of the sea with destructive fishing methods or excessive fishing. So what you've got to do is to control that part as well, and introduce the best of conventional fisheries management there, and by having this combination of protection and sensible, well justified exploitation, then the sea will be a far better breadbasket for humanity.
Yeah, it just seems like a no-brainer to me. Just
It
to
is a
understand.
no-brainer. The trouble is that
What's the problem? Yeah, what's going
between
wrong?
between a good idea and its implementation, there are vested interests,
Yeah.
and one of the problems is that the fishing industry has lots of capital which is tied up in it. Which, if you wanted to cut the size of the fishing fleet, you've got to find some way of easing people out of the industry. So that they're not going to lose all of their
But
savings.
didn't they do that a few years ago? They sort of cut the fleet in half, and they decommissioned loads of boats, and they sent them off to be chopped up in Norway or Denmark, somewhere like that.
It didn't work quite as intended. Yes,
Right.
yes, they did. Decommissioning was a big part of reducing the capacity of the EU fleet. But unfortunately, if you offer somebody the prospect of a handful of money for their fishing vessel to get out of the industry, the people who take that money first are going to be the ones who are least good at fishing, or who have the most rubbishy old boats. And so, this is a way that people who are losing money and that aren't very good at fishing anyway are going to be able to exit.
Jump ship.
The ones who are really good at fishing are making money. They stay in there, and often you find that fishing boats, 5 or 6 boats, are operated by the same owner, and so they'll decommission one and they'll reinvest the money into upgrading the others. So,
so I can see that.
so if you intended to cut the fleet in half, you end up reducing it by about 20%, having spent the money to get rid of half.
Yeah, well, 20% is better than nothing, I suppose.
It is better than nothing.
And then there's a lot of people campaigning, because obviously there's this issue about fish quotas, and our inshore fishermen only having 6% of the fish quotas of the entire sea, and all the offshore fishing companies have a larger percentage. What's all that about?
Well, traditionally, fishing was operated near shore, and then gradually over the course of the 19th century and the 20th century, we saw bigger and bigger vessels being deployed by larger interests. Investment into huge offshore fishing operations went on.
Yep.
So nowadays we have this kind of big offshore industrial fleet, and we have a small scale inshore fleet, which does things like crabbing and lobstering, and they catch small amounts of fin fish as well. Now that fleet has many more fishermen in it than the offshore fleet.
Yeah.
And it's the best source of local fish for local people. So it's one of those sectors of the industry you'd really want to promote, and yet they haven't got the powerful lobbyists. They aren't the ones who are successful in getting the ear of the fishery ministers, and so they've been neglected, relatively speaking. It would be a very good thing, I think, to redeploy some of the fish quotas to that small inshore fleet. That's not to say they have no impact, and some fishing methods used by small-scale fishermen are quite destructive, and I think those are things that we should be phasing out. But on the whole, inshore small-scale is better than large-scale industrial.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Because I was reading your article in The Guardian that came out last year, and you seem quite angry in there about the fact that all these sort of marine protected areas sort of have been set up, sort of on paper, but they hadn't kind of been implemented, or they're sort of enforced. No one's actually. So, what was the consequences of that article? Were there any? You obviously got quite heated and angry about that situation. Did it change anything? Your article in The Guardian, and what's changed since then?
Well, in my article in The Guardian, basically, to put it in a nutshell, I said that the marine conservation zone network that we have now is worse than useless.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's worse than useless because there are now marine protected areas established, and you can point to them on a map, but there is no protection. So they give the illusion that we're protecting the sea in the absence of any meaningful protection. So that's worse than useless, because in the past, when we had no marine protected areas, we knew there was no conservation going on in the sea. Whereas now, we have this illusory protection, these paper parks.
So does anything stop anyone just going in there and trawling and dredging and just ripping up the seabed and taking out every last fish?
At the moment, no, is the answer. None of these areas have any new protection. They were established in 2013 around England, 27 marine conservation zones. There is no requirement to introduce any management until 2016. The management, which is, the signs are that there will be very, very little protection. So, for example, there's a protected area, special area of conservation established under European law off the coast of Norfolk, and it's quite a large area. It's supposed to protect shallow, sandy seabed.
Right.
And if you look at what the Marine Management Organisation has actually protected from mobile fishing gears, which are the ones which do all the damage to this habitat, it's 2 tiny little pocket handkerchief-sized spots. And you could trawl over them in the time it takes to boil a kettle.
That's just madness.
They're just completely useless.
Isn't that weird? It's very weird.
So what's the point of having a protected area of that size if all you're prepared to protect is those tiny little pinpricks in the middle?
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense, does it?
That's the way it's going in Scotland too. They've
so because there is that talk of attaching GPS to boats.
Yes, that's right.
To be able to track where they are, but I know down in Lyme Bay there's reports of actually the fishermen coming in from France and they turn off their radar and their GPS, and then they go and do the trawling, and then when they come out of the zone they switch it back on again. So
well, this is one of the problems. I mean, if you have this VMS system, which is the vessel monitoring system, then if you turn it off, it's against the law to do that. If you're in a managed fishery, which requires it. At the moment, only big vessels need this VMS,
right.
And so only things above 15 meters in length. So the inshore fleet, the small scale fleet, lacks this at the moment. Now, if we want to establish marine protected areas and give them meaningful protection, 2 things have to be done. One is that all boats that are commercially fishing or recreational fishing, for commercial purposes, those must carry VMS regardless of size. And then the second thing is that those signals must be sent very regularly, every minute or so, to the central receiving station. At the moment, many of the VMSs give off 1 ping every 2 hours, which is hopeless for managing these sorts of sites.
So with this artwork, Withdrawn, that I'm working on, I've been buying seaworthy, fishing boats, and the idea is to sort of install them in the woodland. They're going to be acting as a venue for lectures on climate change, the fishing industry, but also choirs turning up and doing performance on them. We're having The Tempest is going to be performed. So the boats act as a venue. But I think when people sort of, walk into the wood and they stumble across this flotilla of boats, they might ask, how they got there, whether they were sort of abandoned by some collapsed fishing industry perhaps, or dumped there by some weird extreme weather tidal surge event. But the interesting thing for me is I'm buying these boats, which are, seaworthy, but I'm buying them for just a couple of £100 on eBay and Gumtree. And it just feels like the boats don't have any real commercial value. Why do you think that might be?
Well, fish stocks have been so overfished that a lot of people aren't making any money any longer. And so if you go to place like Whitby on the Yorkshire coast, it used to be an absolutely thriving fishing port, and now it's down to about 10 fishing boats active, and most of them are for sale. So whoever's fishing out of Whitby is not making enough money to feel that they want to stay in fishing there, and that's happening at ports all around the country. So there's because we've been seeing this decline in fish stocks, fishing opportunities just aren't what they used to be.
Yeah, I mean, lots of the graphs I've seen of fish stocks, they show fish stock levels starting from like the 1970s going down like this. And you think, oh yeah, that's pretty bad. But actually, what they very rarely show is where the fish stocks were at the beginning of the century in the 1900s, which are all the way up here. So the fish stocks have collapsed all the way down to sort of 2 or 3% compared to where they were. And I think the public just don't understand, or kind of there's that sense of perspective, that historical perspective, that people don't kind of realise.
I think part of the reason for that is that fisheries is all about the here and now and what's to come. So fishery managers are interested how many fish are in the sea today and how many can you take tomorrow. And so history gets disregarded if it's more than 2 or 3 years ago, or a decade ago at most. And yet if you do go back in time, you get a very, very different perspective on the state of the sea today.
Yeah.
So one of my students, Ruth Thurston, has gone back to the beginning of fishing records from the late 19th century. That time series starts in 1889, and what it shows is that there's a 17-fold decline in landings per unit of fishing power expended between 1889
I'm trying to get
and
my
now.
head around this units of fishing power expended, because presumably if you start off with a fishing boat and you're sailing out to sea, how does that compare to a boat now with so many with horsepower? So what's the unit per fishing?
Well, the unit that we were using is the sailing smack. And so, starting right at the beginning of this time series, the unit of measure is the landings of a sailing smack per year. And so all the modern advances in fishing technology are converted back into that unit. So a modern day bottom trawler working its way around the North Sea is about 50 times more powerful than a 19th century sailing smack.
So it's not to do with the engine, or it's to do with its ability to catch.
It's the collective ability to catch fish. So that's partly the engine size. They're much bigger, they can drag bigger nets. The nets are much more robust, so you get more successful tows using them, using modern materials. But we're also pinpointing the fish much more effectively using modern day electronics. So, so they don't waste time where there are no fish. We're able to focus in on those places. So it's that collective of advances which makes it so much more powerful than a 19th century boat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's very intelligent industry now, isn't it? The way they're able to sort of really see exactly where the fish are in the sea and then put the net down now. It's amazing. You wondered if you had a modern day fishing trawler, put it in the ocean in the beginning of the 1900s, you would think it would fail to operate. There'd just be too many fish in the sea to catch.
Well, that was certainly true. I mean, some of those early boats as well, when they went offshore and they hit places that had never been fished before, they were catching so many fish. Sometimes they'd have to cut the nets off because they couldn't pull them into the boat, literally. And
then, of course, is it half of the fish that fishermen catch often gets discarded? I understand that there's a change in policy around that's happening from Europe through the sort of from campaigning, I suppose. Everyone just thinks it's ridiculous that you catch all this fish and you chuck half away because they're either too small or the wrong species, or that they don't particularly taste good, and you just chuck them all back in the sea dead. Is that changing?
It is changing, but it's not changing far enough for my money. What's happening is that the EU is now going to ban throwing away bycatch, which is this fish that you're talking about that's undersized or over quota, but it's only going to do it for those species that are subject to quota management. So your grey gurnards, your red gurnards, your rays, all these sorts of species that are not subject to quotas, it's not going to apply to you. You can still chuck those over the side of your boat and discard them.
That seems slightly mad, doesn't it?
It is mad. It's completely mad.